Hello, blogging head.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's going to be that kind of day.
Yes, you go first.
Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is Heather Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change program here at New America in our spiffy new offices.
Hello, I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post, and welcome to the latest edition of Drezburt.
And we should start off by saying Dan has made himself quite the Twitter celebrity this week and attracted a degree of intensity that we're not really used to in the foreign affairs Twitter community by his weighing in on the controversy at Yale over race relations, appropriateness of administration speech, free speech. What else are we calling this controversy?
Contretemps. That's my favorite word to use on this because I think I used it multiple times in the post that I wrote. Also, the question about safe spaces or, how do minority members on campus deal with these kinds of things?
Yeah, and I think Dan may have been hoping that Drezburt would be a safe space for him, free of further conversation on this topic. But I really wanted to, had very powerful echoes for me. Yesterday, I taped a video conversation for a different provider. It felt like I was cheating, but it was me.
It meant nothing to you, though, right, Heather?
It meant yeah. Dan, you're the only one. You're the only one it means anything. Oh dear.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, for the umpteenth time that I have no hope of being confirmed for anything ever. It's just good. It's just good to get that out of the way.
Listen, if I'm unconvertible, I'm bringing everyone else down with me. Go ahead.
But no, so there I was, and I was the youngest member of the conversation on reinventing American foreign policy, and the only non-white male member of the conversation. And I got to tell you what, I'm very proud of what women have been able to do in the field, and I still believe that women are grossly discriminated against in the field, but I'm nobody's diversity poster child. Right. And, the idea that I'm a diversity on a panel people should be embarrassed about, and that just, made me think about how totally insulated our community remains from the currents of debate that are happening at Yale and Mizzou and other places, and what a problem that is for the future of an American foreign policy that looks anything like or is in any way familiar to the majority of people who live in this country.
Huh. Okay, so
I just kind of, every time one of these debates happens, and part of me thinks, oh, thank God, I work in national security and I don't have to deal with this stuff. The other part of me thinks, just wait, because it will come. That we in the national security community should not delude ourselves that we're immune to this kind of debate, this kind of activism, and this kind of scrutiny, frankly. And, we deserve more scrutiny than we get.
Well, okay, so let me offer a few responses. The first, on the general thing about, wading into the Yale thing, you're right. This generated a level of response, and I don't mean response in a nasty sense. I mean, I actually enjoyed the engagement I wound up having on social media and a variety of other things on this because I actually think I learned a lot. Plus, also, I'm enough of a celebrity whore so that I was really happy Don Cheadle tweeted at me. But to tie it more to your specific question about foreign policy, I think this is interesting. I would say I would push back on a few things, though. The first is that I do think things have changed somewhat on this, even in the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm thinking about Foreign Policy Interrupted, for example, and the push to obviously include more women, for example, on foreign policy panels in Washington and more generally. The conference that I actually had last month on foreign policy in 2016, I was pretty damn happy because we honored the Bechdel rule, I think, on all but one panel. And there were a few majority women. So on the gender, I'll leave this way. On the gender issue, I think things have actually changed. The more interesting thing here is the other forms of heterogeneity on this, particularly with respect to questions of race. And I think there's an interesting contrast here because you can argue that at the highest levels of foreign policy, there actually has been more heterogeneity. The last 20 years of secretaries of state, John Kerry, I believe, is the only white guy. Is that correct?
Well, 20 years ago, Warren Christopher was secretary. So you've had two white guys in 20 years.
Okay, I basically since Albright was what I was thinking. But I mean, Albright, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, Hillary Clinton, and now John Kerry. So, and in some ways that I think actually matters a great deal because in questions of, at least in terms of perceptions of the rest of the world, I think that matters. Whether or not, I agree with you that, in questions of race, the foreign policy community is awfully damn white. But not exclusively. And I do think that this is changing over time. A related issue, and this is an uncomfortable one, is whether or not people of color who enter, college or higher education or want to study, foreign affairs or what have you, wind up getting shunted into areas that are not considered high profile. In the same way that, for example, there's the joke in economics that all women go into labor, meaning that a lot of women go into labor economics. And so that winds up being a sort of, stereotypically, female field. I do wonder if a lot of people of color wind up getting directed into studying parts of the world that are not considered high politics, for lack of a better way of putting it.
There's that. I think the other thing that you have to add to that is the sort of high bar to entry into this field, whether it's being able to pay for grad school or whether it's being able to break into a field that basically assumes you will work for free or damn near for free. And if you are already coming out of college with a lot of loans, you just can't do that. So
there's this actually addresses your point. There's a related issue, which is, as you well know, what we're talking about when we talk about the foreign policy community is a very nebulous thing. But the one thing that's definitely true is that it's networked. It's all about who you know, who is your rabbi, who are your mentors, and so forth. And so, that's something that's particularly tough to crack. And I think an additional barrier. I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm not as sanguine about women as you are, and so I'm even less sanguine about members of minority communities, because of that pipeline issue where the difference between, and it's wonderful the signals that we've sent to the world with our high profile appointees. Although I would note that diversity at state, has not been matched. I mean, you have state and the NSC where you had 2 African-American women, but, DOD and the intelligence community are kind of same as it ever was. And if you look down the line and you say to yourself, the other thing that's interesting to note is, of course, we do have grotesque overrepresentation, or grotesque is a wrong word, but we have overrepresentation of minorities in the military. Which, I would not use the word grotesque there. No, sorry, especially on Veterans Day. We have large overrepresentation of minorities in the military, which of course is every bit as much national security policy as what you and I do. And yet it is interesting that that's not translating into a flow of retired Hispanic and African American military professionals into policy jobs.
Well, at first I would push back a little bit. Colin Powell obviously represents the most obvious counterexample to that. And you can argue...
come on. Colin Powell is the exception.
Right. But the other question is whether this is a generational effect, which is to say, as you have veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan starting to, get to the age where they can either run for office and or serve appointed office, will you see an increase? But that's a frustrating answer to give because it says, well, just wait. And, I acknowledge that's not necessarily the easiest answer to offer.
Although you make an interesting point because I can immediately think of 2 Asian American female legislators, who are veterans. Right. So you're right that there's a generational change happening. But at the same time, you have the network problem that you referred to earlier. And so I just think incidents like what we've seen in the past couple of days ought to remind us to look for similar patterns in our own areas of endeavor. How's that?
I have no problem with that point and would agree. And and the other thing is that I think, unfortunately, it's going to be a frustratingly slow process. Although I have to admit, part of this for me is difficult to deal with because at Fletcher, this is not an issue. Mostly because half of the students that I'm teaching are overseas students, and so as a result, it's a pretty damn heterogeneous group. But you're right that part of the issue is I think what one of my best friends once described as the hourglass problem, which is it's extremely easy if you take a look sort of at the junior level, sort of younger to mid-20s till about 30, the sort of foreign policy people are pretty damn diverse. And then people get married and start to have children and other things, mortgages need to be paid and so on and so forth. And then there is often a brutal winnowing at that point. And it might be that the winnowing is skewed.
Well, I mean, I think the winnowing is still quite skewed by gender. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all that it's at least as skewed by race and ethnicity. But speaking of astonishing progress on race and ethnicity, we should switch here to the Republican debate last night.
Right.
And the reason that we want to talk about this particular Republican debate is that we finally had in public the thing that foreign policy wonks have been saying for about 2 years now would happen, which was that we actually had a debate between the
wings.
Neocon and I'm trying to think of a word that isn't isolationist.
Non-interventionist.
The neocon wing, then the non-interventionist wing of the Republican Party. And I rather doubt that you will see that in any more full flower than you saw it last night, in part because I think that may have been sort of Ron Paul's last great gasp.
Rand Paul.
But,
sorry.
No, what would I do without you?
It's possible. Although, I mean, it was very interesting to me, at least, the post-debate reaction, because I agree with you that this might be Rand Paul's last gasp on the main stage. Although you never know, because in some ways this was the debate where I think he most fully articulated his foreign policy position, which I assume is going to be at least popular with some element of the Republican Party, or Republican Party voters. I mean, they're not all neocons in that sense. And I do wonder, there is a slight chance I would offer that if Donald Trump fades more, that some of those voters would actually go to Rand Paul. Because Trump is actually weirdly the not all that interventionist either, as his answer on Syria suggested. Go ahead.
That was one of the fascinating things last night, that you saw Trump lining up with Paul, not just on Syria, but also in terms of sort of, obviously we have to keep talking to Russia and China. Right. I don't know that I can talk to him because we hung out in the green room. I'm not sure it's really quite fair to class that with Paul's view of the world, but you could draw a pretty clear line between the two of them and the rest of the field, and you got to see that clearly. And I think, if Republican voters are watching the whole debate and they see that and they think to themselves, that makes sense. What was really remarkable to me was how much the audience for that particular debate was really amped up to be negative on both Paul and Trump on those issues. You had an audience that seemed very primed to represent the way the Republican Party establishment has been working to sideline the Rand Paul view of the world. So in a funny way, I mean, although I thought Paul made, the best statement of his case, although it was also almost like it was set up to push it aside.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few things. First, it's always dangerous to judge how well a debate plays by how well it plays in that audience, because, obviously it's a cue that we will pick up, but it's not obvious to me that voters more generally are, they on the one hand might take that cue, but on the other hand they might reject it. The other thing that I thought was interesting was, you're right. I mean, on the whole, Paul was really, when the serious foreign policy debate started, Trump actually didn't open his mouth, which was probably his brightest move. Because the one time he did try to articulate anything of substance when he talked about TPP, Rand Paul schooled him pretty badly because he got fundamental facts about the agreement wrong. But to step back more generally, the debate between Paul and Rubio in particular was interesting because you're right. Pretty much every other person on that stage sort of sided with Rubio on this. In words I never thought I was going to say out loud, Ted Cruz actually tried to kind of like steer a moderate third path between the two of them. And I actually thought did so in a reasonably effective way. The line about, you think it's expensive to defend America, try not defending America. Yeah, it's a good line. And I think, articulated, suggested an interesting position for Cruz to take. I think in some ways, the really interesting thing going forward is going to be how well does Rand Paul continue to do in the polling, and does he get kicked off that stage or not? Because if he does, you can argue it'll be very easy to write the narrative of, okay, the Republican voters are clearly, favor the sort of neocon worldview in a way that Paul does not represent. Although I will point out that it's far from obvious to me that foreign policy really is going to influence how voters do. So it might be that Rubio, for example, and Cruz do well as a result of this debate, but I don't know if that had anything to do with foreign policy. It's that we were paying attention to the foreign policy stuff because that actually was a genuinely, as you say, substantive, interesting interaction between the two.
Yep. Two things about that. First, it's an interesting point about Cruz that when he first came to Congress, many of the non-interventionist Republicans in D.C. were expecting him to join their ranks and be something of a champion. And I was involved in some early efforts to try to reach out to him on a number of issues where Republicans and Democrats have worked together on civil liberties, surveillance, Guantanamo. And Cruz, everyone was a little bit surprised that Cruz hewed as much to the mainline Republican positions as he has. So there is clearly the temptation there to try to figure out how he can scoop up that part of Trump's audience. I also was really interested to see Rand Paul opted to make his presentation really starting from, the sort of what is a conservative, right, and making a very fiscal argument. Yeah. So I went back and looked at some polling this morning, and you've seen Republican voters shift away from looking at national security through that lens for about a year and a half now. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't have time to go back and look at was how much that tracks with world events versus how much it tracks with some of the commentators and TV newscasters who are the most influential voices in Republican opinion shaping, deciding that they had about enough of Rand Paul and that they wanted to sort of push the base back the other way. And I think that's an important thing to look at because, frankly, 2 years ago, the approach that Paul took last night was polling very well in the party. And I think the fact that you just saw this enormous plus up to defense spending through an off-budget method, which in principle should be anathema to fiscal conservatives, shows you how much that needle has moved on Republican public opinion.
Well, I would say a few things have happened. I mean, if I was going to argue why this is the case, I agree with your objective, your argument that this is not playing as well with Republican voters as it did 2 years ago. I would say there are probably three reasons for that. The first is the sort of world is on fire argument, which is just debatable, but nonetheless, the fact that you've seen a lot of sort of conflagrations in the world that are far more headline grabbing than they used to be, feeds this sense that we're in a more insecure world and therefore we have to spend more on defense. I think the second thing is that Paul himself, throughout most of 2014, actually, it's not that he sounded like a hawk, but he sounded more hawkish. I think one of Paul's strategies all of last year was to try to convince sort of conservative Republicans that he really wasn't his father and that he did believe in certain instances in overseas intervention and what have you. So part of it, I think, is that he dialed down the rhetoric. And the third, and let's be blunt about this, because it was, in some ways, that was the largest source of cognitive dissonance in last night's debate, is that, the economy has actually done pretty damn well over the last 2 years. And so as a result, the sort of fiscal picture, while in the long term is obviously a source of some concern, most of the fiscal doomsaying that has been taking place by Republicans over the last 5 years, turned out to be wrong. And so if it turns out that, the economy is growing by a little more than they expected, and more importantly, tax revenues are a little more than they expected, it's not shocking if they decide, let's spend all that on defense.
Well, the one piece that I would add to that analysis, and it's something I implied earlier, is this kind of mediating question of where is the Republican base taking its cues from? And there's really interesting work looking at younger voters from both parties and saying, who do you consider the party leadership? Who are the people that you get your information about what is a good Republican or what is a good Democrat or what is a good conservative? And when you ask, this was done in exit polling, and when you ask young Democrats this, they say Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton. So there's an identification of
elites,
elected officials with what are you supposed to think if you are a Democrat. For young Republicans, it was TV figures.
Oh, God.
Not elected officials. So, it's not John Boehner or even Justin Amash telling you what to think. It's the TV talking heads and the radio talking heads. So that you have, and this is just an interesting aside on climate change, that you have this situation which Greg Sargent wrote about in the Post, it's been last week, and you saw in the debate last night that the party elites are well aware that climate change is a real thing. Yeah. And you now see majorities of Republicans saying, yes, climate change is a real thing. We're still not sure who's causing it, and we still think it's a bad idea to spend money to do anything about it, but we think it's happening. But then you have Tea Party and evangelical voters still saying it's not a real thing, it's not happening. And, there's where you see the actual elected leadership of the Republican Party and its media leadership, pushing different lines in a way that, you had a couple candidates last night actively trying to straddle.
Okay, that's interesting, although I would say that the one part of that argument that sticks out to me and makes me wonder is that you said that this is how younger GOP voters get their cues. And the fact is the GOP skews much older. Yeah. And so this actually causes me to wonder two things. First, this helps to explain why in so many polls you see Trump and Carson doing so well, because they, play well. They either play well on television or they particularly play well with the very talking heads that you're talking about. That said, if that's the case, it would not shock me at all if those polls show right up to Iowa that these guys are doing well, and then it turns out they actually don't do well in the actual voting because their young voters don't show up.
Well, what you just described is in many ways, you could extend that to the political system writ large, right? Because in some ways what we just had here in Washington with the budget deal and the elevation of Paul Ryan as speaker is kind of the establishment striking back. And the insiders whose modes of power exercised through traditional committee structures and the traditional party structures have been a little bit in abeyance the past few years, kind of figuring out how to reorganize and reassert themselves. And if you could imagine, particularly frankly in Iowa where organizing is key and, there is sort of a known magic to how you do a caucus successfully. Right. And you could easily imagine Trump and Carson getting out organized by people who know how the system works. Exactly. New Hampshire and other states that don't have the caucus system, it's a little more challenging. But
although even there, it's partly a lot. It's retail politics, which requires a certain effort. Yeah, which requires certain skills not normally associated either with brain surgery or deal making. Yes. But no, and this is where I think we're living in this odd period in the U.S. where both power structures are operating at the same time. Yeah. And at any given moment, your part of your job as an analyst is to figure out which power structure is going to win in a given situation. And we're operating in this sort of weird reality. Although I would also add there is a distinct, and we should probably move on to actual foreign affairs beyond this, but there is a genuine, startling role reversal here from when you and I were kids, for lack of a better way of putting it, in which everything you're describing fits the tensions within the Republican Party and the conservative movement more generally. If you switch and move to the Democrats, the Democratic nomination is playing out so perfectly along the party decides kind of model that it's striking to me in the degree to which this is how it used to work in Republican in Republican nominations of nominations passed, whereas the Democrats, it was always the free for all. But it's just striking to me the extent to which it's been reversed.
Yeah, although I have to say, I mean, Sanders is doing better than I think anyone thought he would do, or that the Party Decides model suggested he could do. So I think if Democrats get too complacent along the lines that you just said, they're and this actually is maybe a good way of shifting our lens from the U.S. to overseas, because everywhere from the Israeli elections, the British. Both the British parliamentary elections and then the unexpected elevation of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader, the Canadian elections that just happened, where you've had dynamics that were not the way it always works.
Right. No, that's a fair point. It does raise this interesting question. We talk a lot in the United States about the rise of political polarization, particularly among the elites. The evidence that I've seen suggests somewhat less so among ordinary citizens, although what's happening with ordinary citizens is that they're engaging in what's called party sorting, which means that what people that used to be conservative Democrats now say, oh, no, I'm actually a Republican. It's not that their views have changed necessarily. It's that they're joining the appropriate party from an ideological perspective.
We give you the Kentucky gubernatorial
Exactly. What is interesting is whether polarization, as we talk about it in the United States, is a more global phenomenon. Because again, take a look at the UK, where you have Jeremy Corbyn, who I believe is slightly to the left of, Khrushchev, in terms of his articulation of what he wants. Cameron's conservative, but he has to deal with the UKIP, fringe on the right. Or for that matter, the depth of ideological divergence in the Canadian election, although that doesn't work quite as well because I believe Trudeau is far more moderate than, let's say, the NDP, which was the true liberal or true left party there. But also think about Poland, where you had a reactionary movement, or a more reactionary right party take charge. Israel's election, as you said. This is one of the interesting questions for comparative politics, is whether you can talk about polarization in the American context and think about whether it applies more globally.
Right, and how much that has, and is there a way that we are misunderstanding it in the U.S. by mapping our two-party system onto
parliamentary systems? That's true. Because my understanding is actually, I had to do I did some research on this, and my understanding is that at least until 2008, after that I haven't seen much evidence, but until 2008, the evidence in Europe was actually for less polarization, not more. But I do wonder if things have changed post-2008 and post-Euro crisis.
Well, I guess, yeah. And it's almost, again, what I'm suspicious about is how well the polarization that's happening follows the traditional party lines in Europe. That you have the combination of the economic crisis in Europe and now the
refugee crisis,
which is, it's important. It's not just this refugee crisis.
Well, it's a larger immigration question and questions about national identity. Yeah.
Yep. And this actually seems like a good place to pivot to one of the other things we said we were going to talk about, which is that David Cameron this week came out and gave a speech in which he basically laid down conditions for a deal that he wants to negotiate with the EU and then bring back to the UK and hold a referendum saying, under these conditions, should we stay in the EU? And what was fascinating about he had 4 conditions, which basically were give the European Parliament more power and roll back the power of the EU bureaucracy, roll back EU regulation and increase competitiveness, and give national authorities more power to restrict the flow of people across borders. Give the UK, which doesn't even belong to the Schengen agreement that allows for free circulation, more power to keep people out, to send them back. And what was fascinating, as someone who dips in and out of close EU watching, is that unlike 10 or 20 years ago, where the suggestion that the speed and depth of EU coming together could be stopped would have been heresy. Mm-hmm. What you heard from French and German and other commentators was, that's negotiable. We can figure all of that out. The thing that's not negotiable is free movement of people. And that was surprising to me. I mean, it made me realize that I'm not as in touch with all things European as I should be.
When you say free movement of people, I assume you're talking about free movement of EU citizens.
Well, there's two pieces to it. One is free movement of EU citizens, right. And then that gets, again, conflated with the problem of who has to take refugees and where they have to go and what you have to do with them when they get to you.
All right.
And it's part of the reason that yes, a Syrian who gets to the UK is going to be treated differently from a Pole who gets to the UK.
I hope so.
But part of the angst about Syrians is a frustration over Poles. So LES, not LLS.
I understand.
So actually the creation of the free movement regime, or freer movement, again, because the UK doesn't belong to Schengen,
right.
But that created and accentuated a lot of socio-economic, cultural angst. And, the Syrians and Afghans are now sort of on the sharp end of that, but it didn't happen because of the Syrians and Afghans. It happened because of a decade of Eastern Europeans.
Yeah, I mean, so, all right. As someone who was in the UK a few weeks ago and testified to the House of Lords EU committee, I will grandiosely claim expertise on it. No. First of all, if you ever do get the opportunity to testify in front of the House of Lords, I highly recommend you take it. It was just worth it for the experience alone.
I don't suppose you get to wear a wig, do you?
No, I was bitterly disappointed about this. I was hoping for more silly pomp and circumstance. And I mean, not even the names of the earls and barons and lords and baronesses were all that silly, frankly. It was a little depressing on that sense. On the other hand, as I'm sure since you've had to testify in front of Congress, you will be cheered to know that they actually all showed up and paid attention. So that was a pleasant surprise, frankly. And worth it. I mean, in some ways, weirdly, if those are Cameron's demands, this leads me to be optimistic that A, Brexit is not going to happen, and B, that some deal will in fact be cut, because the demands that he's making are not demands unique to Britain. And that you could argue this is something that, in fact, weirdly, the Poles themselves would probably agree with respect to, more power to national authorities, on a variety of things, and deregulation and what have you. And the Euro Parliament thing is an interesting move, although between you, me, and the lamppost, I'm not sure that's going to play out quite the way Cameron wants it. If it was actually implemented, I'm not sure that would play out the way anyone would anticipate, because the European Parliament elections have ridiculously low levels of turnout. But in some ways, what this is Cameron's way of finessing what is, I assume, British skepticism about the European Union, while at the same time a fundamental recognition by Cameron and presumably conservative elites that would actually be an unmitigated disaster for Britain to leave the European Union. And indeed, what was interesting to me was the extent when I was over there, and this made waves when I was over there, was the fact that U.S. authorities made it very clear that if Britain were to exit the European Union, there would be no inclusion of Britain in TTIP. And that actually kind of startled some people, and I think caused a slight reorientation of views. Why are you laughing?
Honestly, I was laughing at imagining how quick a Republican administration would be to reverse that.
Maybe. I'm not sure what a Republican administration would say about this. And there are actually strong geopolitical reasons why, if you were a Republican, you would want Britain to stay in the EU and not exit.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. But you also would, I mean, that sort of falls in the category of things that are smart to do from an overall geopolitical perspective, but in terms that can also be viewed as a kind of, oh my gosh, the special relationship.
Yeah, although, let me put it this way. If nothing else, it's encouraging. Maybe it's because the issue didn't make the Republican radar, but I don't think I've heard any of the GOP candidates. I mean, this would have been a golden moment for them to say that.
Probably shouldn't talk about
well,
it.
I've blown everything. But I mean,
damn it, Drezner.
I'm sorry. But to be fair, I don't think I've heard any GOP candidates actually suggest this, which suggests that maybe it won't quite play out the way you thought. But go ahead.
Well, and it is also true that it's the kind of thing that really shouldn't be a presidential issue. I just wanted to make one comment back on the European Parliament piece, which connects to the comment you made about your testimony, that it's really easy for any sitting government to suggest that the European Parliament have more power, in as much as, national parliaments, well, particularly over our issues, national parliaments have less power over foreign and security policy and economic policy in Europe than they do here. The European Parliament has less power relative to the EU than national parliaments have relative to their national governments. So it's also that unfortunately makes it kind of sad about, when a whole room full of people show up to listen to you, but they still have relatively little impact on what their government does. Mm-hmm.
No, I don't disagree with that. But let me put it this way: if that's what Cameron's proposing, I suspect there is a deal that can be made, and I suspect it will ensure that Great Britain stays in the European Union.
I was struck by the way that Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, said in Ireland this week that if he were a British citizen and walked into the voting booth, his hand would be wandering toward no, but he hoped his head would assert control and push yes.
I mean, the general when I was over there, the general consensus seemed to be that this was going to play out in many ways like the Scottish referendum did, in that it's this kind of thing where perhaps maybe even a little bit better, because you can argue that Cameron's, trying to go out in front on this, but in the sense of that at any moment where it looks like the no vote might actually win, there will be a concentrated rhetorical fire making it exactly, expressly clear what the costs are of an actual British exit from the European Union. Which is why I think it's one of these things that, like, if you knew that you could make a no vote as a protest without there actually being any consequences, I think people would do it. But the moment that this actually becomes a live wire, I think people will vote with their pocketbook.
So here's our great kind of totally slate pitchy construct for the day. Yeah. The British EU referendum will be more like the Scottish referendum than the Catalonian parliamentary elections. Discuss.
There you go. We'll leave that to the commenters. So
you, speaking of other things that start with B, yes. You've also been opining about the BRICs lately.
Yes, I wrote a nice eulogy for the BRICs yesterday. So the BRICs, obviously, is an acronym that refers to Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. And I've been doing a little research on them for this book that I'm writing called The Ideas Industry. And one of the things that is striking about the BRICs as a political grouping is that it started as a Goldman Sachs marketing term. That Jim O'Neill came up with the term back in 2001 as a way of arguing that people should invest in the developing world. And this led to actual real-world consequences. First, in that Goldman Sachs and then others set up so-called BRICs funds, in which there were acronym funds designed to target investments in the developing world. And then beginning somewhat in 2006 and then more concretely in 2009, the BRICs themselves, his original formulation didn't include South Africa, led to actual meetings and summits of heads of state and foreign ministers. And now we have something called the New Development Bank, which is capitalized, I believe, at $100 billion, set up by the BRICs, that could be seen by some as an alternative to the pre-existing Bretton Woods institutions. However, and there was a lot of panic. You can feel free to push back on me on this, but I always got the impression that the BRICs got a lot of attention in Washington as this sort of world without the West example of developing countries somehow finding alternative means. And now, over the last 2 months, two things have happened that are worth taking note. The first is that Goldman Sachs has shut down its BRICs fund, or rather merged that BRICs fund with another emerging market fund. And partly it's done so because, gosh, it turned out that since its peak, that BRICs fund has lost 88% of its value, because it turns out that these countries aren't doing quite as well as O'Neill predicted. Although, to be fair, his original prediction actually does hold up pretty well. But post-2008, they've all slowed down dramatically. And furthermore, you're actually beginning to see, I think, some movement within the think tank community suggesting, yeah, we exaggerated the BRICs a little bit. So there's a CSIS report I'm going to forget his name and I apologize for that, but basically arguing that there are hard constraints on what the BRICS can actually do, that they have not articulated a genuinely alternative strategy to sort of existing liberal order, and that beyond the development bank, there really isn't going to be much in the way of actual coherent foreign policy among this grouping. And so, this is one of those moments where I would like to say, fuzzy geoeconomic concepts, please rest in peace and never come back.
Well, it's irresistible to come back with the death of the BRICS is premature.
There you go, fair enough.
And so thank you for setting me up with that construct. And I do think, to the extent that the history of the construct is as a money-making construct for Goldman Sachs, what's sort of interesting about that is that it gets taken from being a money-making construct and turned into a political capital-making construct for the BRICS themselves. And I'm struck just at a very sort of anecdotal level that I had the fun of trying to explain the U.S. political system 2016 specifically over lunch to a delegation of high-level Russians last Friday. Yeah, you can only imagine how much fun that was. But at one point, in trying to explain how Americans think about national security policy, I got a long lecture back from the senior Republican on the delegation that started with Lermontov and ended with the BRICS. Its basic point seeming to be that the U.S. was stuck in imperial hubris akin to that of the officers in the 19th century Caucasus that Lermontov depicts, although I was never quite sure that was supposed to be the metaphor, but anyway, from a Russian political economy point of view, the BRICS are very much alive and very useful.
Oh, sure.
And, similarly from a Chinese and Brazilian point of view, which in no case was it ever primarily about making money.
Right.
For them.
Of course not. No, except for the, yeah.
So to the extent that you have the development bank, and just a little sort of interesting anecdote I saw this week that, U.S. and Western banks have not rushed back into Iran as fast as maybe we all thought they would. And I saw somewhere an unattributed quote saying, well, nobody wants to be the first, but also nobody wants to be the second or third. Everybody wants to be the sixth. And I thought, well, that'll be easy because the first five will be Chinese. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether we're actually not sort of going to move toward a two-tier system where, yes, we're going to continue to have the institutions of either first or last resort, depending on how you look at it, and the capital markets of first or last resort. But it's also going to be the case that you're going to have enormous amounts of money and influence that deliberately choose not to move through those institutions. So, we're going to move from, if you forgive this grotesque analogy, we're going to move to a multipolar economic world or a multi-system economic world. And so it's not going to be a question of Bretton Woods or something else. It's going to be a question of Bretton Woods and something else.
First of all, you're fixated on the word grotesque today, so,
I am.
But second, I would say a few things on this. The first is, it's not shocking to me that the Russians talked up the BRICS a lot to you. The Russians need the BRICS more than anyone else.
Yep.
Them talking up the BRICS does not mean the BRICS are as influential as they want it to be. I agree with you that it would be, in some ways, as much as I say fuzzy geoeconomic concept, rest in peace, I agree with you that there are ways in which the BRICS as a political grouping still matter. $100 billion capitalized into a bank is real. And the one thing that these five actors do share is a resentment at being underrepresented in Western financial institutions, in the Bretton Woods institutions. So long as that perception still holds, these groupings will still have some kind of salience. That said, to your larger concern about will you have Bretton Woods and other institutions, it's going to take a long time for that to be the case. Russia tried to do something like this in the immediate wake of the imposition of sanctions, in terms of like coming up with an alternative means of, let's say, credit card payments, and they failed miserably at it. And in no small part, this is because I think there are genuine divisions within the BRICs themselves about the necessity of doing this, which is the Russians really, really want it. I don't think any of the other 4 members are as keen about this. And provided the United States, and we've talked about this before, shows some restraint in its political use of the financial system, which is a fancy way of saying not sanction everyone, I don't think it'll trigger the kind of thing you're talking about, at least anytime in the short term. Not to mention the fact that for any of this to actually take place, it will require China to actually be willing to open up its financial system and set up the renminbi as an alternative reserve currency. And events of the last 6 months suggest to me that if anything, despite claims that they want to move in that direction, they're not actually moving in that direction. So it'll take some time for that to happen. So there are things I worry about. This one I'm relatively sanguine about.
Yeah, no, your last point, I think, is your strongest one, that of all the things that China is taking on, making the renminbi into a reserve currency does not appear to be high on their list. Yeah. And that limits at some level what can be done otherwise. Although I'm a little less sanguine than you are, frankly, in part because once the BRICs started on their own set of slowdowns post 2008 and were less attractive markets for capital from other places, right, which is happening slowly, but is finally starting to happen. In some ways that frees those economies up to care a little bit less. And so then if among themselves they can do deals that happen at their own tier without some of the same levels of scrutiny and structure that come where Bretton Woods institutions money goes, that's where I think you end up with this kind of second speed. But there's limit. You're right that there's limits on that, as long as you're not moving toward a reserve currency model.
That sounds right. And with that, I kind of need to get going.
Yeah, no, I think we've that was the good, from the domestic to the geopolitical.
But Heather, a pleasure as always.
You too. Have a lovely Thanksgiving.
Same to you.
We'll see you in December with red Starbucks cups.
There we go. All right, take care.
Bye-bye.